All right, guys, over the next 3 weeks, which is as of right now when we're supposed to be going back, we're going to go over a new unit called the Reform Movement. Okay. If you remember back to the Industrial Revolution, we talked about certain things that improved society, but we also talked about a lot of things that made negative effects on society. So remember all the women and children working in terrible environments. Amongst other things. So the reform movements is when people are going to change society to try and change it for the better. In this unit, we're going to break it down into 3 different lessons. Today, we're going to talk about the Second Great Awakening, which is about religion, and then we're going to talk about prison reform. As you can see on the rest of this chart, there are other movements. The temperance movement, which is all about like ending the sale of alcohol. All right, abolitionist movement is ending slavery. Women's rights is getting rights for women. And then education, we're going to try and get those kids out of the factories and into free public education. So we'll be breaking these up over the next couple weeks, but today we're going to talk about asylum or penal reform, which is like prison reform in mental health hospitals, as well as the Second Great Awakening. So first of all, let's start with what does reform mean? Okay, simply put, reform means that we're going to try and change something in order to improve it. All right. Um, so this is when we're going to try and change society from how it was bad to how it was good. There are negative things going on in society, and we need to try and fix them and make them better. So the question I have here are what are some things that you guys think would need to be changed? And I kind of mentioned them on the previous slide. Um, One thing I think that would need to be changed would be children working in factories and not going to school. Um, so during this time, we're going to work on getting better schools and more schools for children. Also, we're going to start to help women get rights. Remember, they were not making nearly as much money as men, and they didn't have other rights yet, such as voting and things like that. So these are some things that during this reform movement in the late 1800s, we're going to start to, or mid to late 1800s, we're going to start to reform and change society to try and improve them. The reform movement, though, starts with not necessarily trying to change certain members of society or things of society, but change religion and viewpoints on religion. Um, the first Great Awakening happened at the beginning of like the year. We didn't really talk about it much, but it was kind of an argument that people needed to go to church in order to find God and go to heaven. The Second Great Awakening is still about trying to get to heaven. However, we don't need to go to church necessarily to go to heaven. All we need to do is we need to do good things. All right. If we do good things, then God's going to see that we're good people, and then we will go to heaven. Doesn't necessarily mean that we have to go to church. Um, so this really sparks that reform movement because people are going to start to try and change society for the better so they can be quote unquote saved and sent to heaven. All right, so they're going to start to try and help children get schools. They're going to try to help slavery end. And if you try and do this, then theoretically God will send you to heaven. You don't necessarily need to go to church. So that's what the Second Great Awakening is pretty much all about. The leader of the Second Great Awakening was a guy named Charles Finney. Okay, not gonna talk a whole bunch about him, but he used a lot of sermons, okay, speeches with a lot of emotion to get his point across to people. The quote over here on the right is a very good one on him. It says, "No man can possibly be benevolent or religious to the full extent of his obligations without concerning himself to a greater or less extent with the affairs of a human government." Essentially, what he's saying there is you cannot be fully religious and you cannot go to heaven if you're not helping out humans. All right, so people first believed you just had to go to church to go to heaven, but I think everyone can agree there are people that go to church that aren't necessarily great people. So he's saying not only do you have to go to church, but you also have to be a good human being and help out humans. And that's what the Second Great Awakening is all about. During this Second Great Awakening, a guy named Ralph Waldo Emerson is going to create another idea called Transcendentalism. It's a big word. Um, and what Transcendentalism is about is questioning society's rules, right? So if you think back to the American Revolution, one of the main things that people would argue was if we should be paying taxes without having any representation, correct? So the founding fathers argued that and fought against that because they were questioning the rules of society. All right. Um, and Ralph Waldo Emerson's going to continue that argument. And then that's when people start to question some of the things going on, and now we need to improve them. He also believed that nature was a good way to find God. So that also has something to do with the Second Great Awakening. One of his main followers is Henry David Thoreau. He really believed in transcendentalism, and he was an author. He lived in the woods for 2 years writing a book. Another thing that he's very famous for is he questioned the Mexican-American War. He did not agree with the Mexican-American War. So since he did not agree with what it was, he decided that he would not pay his taxes. All right. Since he didn't pay his taxes, he would go to jail. And that's kind of what transcendentalism is all about, questioning society and then arguing against it. So while he was in jail, he wrote a book called Civil Disobedience, which we just described. Okay, if you don't think something's right, you should stand up for it, as this poster says right here, and you may even have to go to jail for it. The next thing we're going to talk about is the first movement in the reform movement, and that is prison reform. All right. Most of y'all think of prison as a pretty bad place, and that's a good viewpoint to think of it. But prisons today are 100 times better than they were back in the 1800s. Nowadays, they have different education systems. They have a pretty comfortable room, cell, I guess you would say. They have access to a lot of different resources. During the 1800s, if you were sent to prison, you were pretty much just chained up against a wall, or you were locked in cages like an animal. Not really healthy conditions, and it was not very good. Also, children were put into prisons with adults, which is not a safe thing to go on. And also, you could be sent to jail if you were in debt, all right, which doesn't make a lot of sense, because if you're in debt, and you go to jail, the only way to get out of jail is to pay off your debt. But if you can't pay off your debt because you're in jail, you'll never get out of jail. So there's going to be one woman that really focuses on reforming prisons during this time, and that woman's name is Dorothea Dix. Okay, Dorothea Dix was a teacher of Sunday schools and jails, and when she would go into these jails, she would see how bad the conditions were. So taking that idea of the Second Great Awakening and changing society for the better, she's going to try to reform or change up the prison system in the United States. This quote here on the bottom right, man is not made better by being degraded. She's saying that if we're trying to get these criminals to change ways, if we degrade them by locking them up like animals, they're not going to change their ways. So we need to treat them with humanity and help them out to teach them how to be better humans, and that's what prison should be about, not about the straight punishment, but also rehabilitation. She also saw that the mentally ill were also not cared for properly. They were similar to prisons, where they would be sent into an asylum that was pretty much like locking them up in cages, and you're not really treating them or helping them, you're just kind of locking them away. They were crowded, they were dirty. If they misbehaved, they would be whipped. And really, they're not getting any help at all. They're just kind of being forgotten about. So Dorothea Dix is also not just going to push for prison reform, but for mental illness and helping these people get the help that they need. Um, so she really pushes for mental health reform and prison reform. Um, Overall, just as a quick little recap on her outcomes of prison reform, she would go through multiple states and gather data on different information from the states on how their prisoners were treated. She was able to create special mental hospitals instead of prisons for the mentally ill. So now they're being helped and they're being cared for instead of just being locked away in a prison. By the time she died, if you were in debt, you no longer went to prison, which really helped out people in debt because, once again, if they're in debt and they're in jail, they can't get out of debt, which means they can't get out of jail. They started making different prisons or places to go for children instead of putting them in adult prisons. And this is also going to be a good place to try and rehabilitate children, give them education and things like that. And also she's going to really focus on the Eighth Amendment of no cruel and unusual punishments, which I think being locked in a small cage or chained to a wall would be classified as cruel or unusual punishments. And that will no longer happen. So if you look at these pictures to the right, you have a pretty comfortable, I would think, cell room. He's got a TV, a comfy bed, and other things. And then in the bottom right, it's a school or it's a classroom within a prison, and it shows the different resources they have. These are conditions we may not have in prisons today if it wasn't for Dorothea Dix. So for the rest of today, I'm not going to lie, it's going to be kind of boring. I could not find a lot of internet resources to kind of help you out here. So you're going to have two different readings and answering questions. I will also read the readings and attach those videos if you're someone who does not, who needs assistance with some of the readings. Otherwise, you can read it on your own and answer the questions. You don't have to listen to me. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or call me. Not call me, email me, and I will get back to you as quickly as possible. Thank you. Have a good day.